Thank you, panel, and thank you, Melbourne, for joining the annual Iona Talks About Brexit round. We think that Brexit was sold on a lie. Not just one, but multiple, about what the contents of being in the EU was actually like, but more crucially, about what leaving the EU would be like and what a Brexit would plausibly look like. We think that the democratic mandate and legitimacy that exists for the current Brexit arrangement is illegitimate, and we further tell you that by having a second referendum, we improve the process by which a Brexit would occur, even if people do confirm that support. Very clear stance from Kit and I. In terms of what we believe this debate looks like, we just provide all the information on the deal that would get compromised upon and put that on various advertising agencies, on the news, etc., and then have people vote on it again with no deal as, with Remain as the alternative and no deal being off the ballot. So it's just between the soft Brexit that's proposed and between Remain. So, 3 claims coming from opening government. First, I'm going to talk about why the first referendum was illegitimate and why the second one is better. Second, I want to talk about why even if Brexit is voted upon in the system, why it happens in a far more cohesive and legitimate way. And lastly, I want to talk about general democratic cohesion. So, to begin with, why was the first referendum illegitimate? I have 6 different reasons why. First of all, I want to point out the vagueness that existed within the original Brexit arrangement and the original Brexit referendum. People didn't know what version of Brexit they were voting on, and for that reason, that meant people oftentimes voted for Brexit on directly contradictory terms. So for instance, some people want to have more autonomy over spending, have more flexibility to increase funding within the NHS, for instance, so they were classic liberals. But then there are other people who wanted to get rid of the EU so they could deregulate the state and become more of a neoliberal state like Singapore or a country like the USA. These are directly competing visions for what the role of the state was and why Brexit was necessary. Furthermore, if you look at all the options that are currently on the table, oftentimes the lies that were told within that Brexit campaign mean that you can't actually have any of the compromises. For instance, if you have a customs union, which is one of the proposed alternatives, you can't negotiate trade deals with other countries, which is one of the big reasons why people felt comfortable with pursuing Brexit in the first place. If you choose the Norway option of having greater integration with the European Union, you can't control the freedom of movement, which is a significant problem for many Brexit voters. If you choose to have a more soft Brexit in general, you might have compliance with EU regulations still. So that means that a variety of different reasons why people were voting and reasons why they voted for that referendum in the very first place are oftentimes, though, dispelled by the specific version of Brexit which occurs, which means that the only way in which you can get a true implication of democratic rule is by having a very specific model by which people can understand the implications of the decision. No thanks. Second reason why this is illegitimate, there are potential electoral campaign finance breaches where there's too much funding given towards the Leave side of Brexit. Third of all, there are changes in composition of the voting base now. I think that the preferences of people now matter just as much as the preferences of people in 2016, and the fact that there are new eligible voters means that they should be considered as well. Fourth, there were lies about what being in Brexit actually looked like. So people claimed that the NHS was being had money sucked out of it by the EU when that was in fact factually incorrect. Lies about the common agricultural policy and how much the UK had to subsidize farming within Europe was lying in terms of the figures. The fifth thing that I think is important to note is that the wording of the ballot in the original case was incredibly deceptive. So there are books that suggest that the term leave is sexier than remain, and that created perhaps a 0.5% percentage difference in the very first referendum, which is critical because it was simply 52% to 48%. No thanks. The sixth and final thing I want to note is that people didn't have a reasonable understanding of the implications that this would have on Northern Ireland and Scotland. The fact that this would fracture that union. And while we believe people have the right to make that decision, they didn't have the information to contemplate the consequences of Brexit. So these are all the reasons why the original Brexit referendum was illegitimate. We think the difference now, I'll take in a moment, is that we have a present and clearer deal that will be able to be proposed, and thus people can vote on that. Sure.
If this is a principle, isn't it self-defeating insofar as you describe 7 different options that are available, but you're only allowing people to vote on one of the options or Remain?
Okay, but this is about comparatives, right? A world in which you have 7 unclear options that are potentially what you're voting for is one in which no one's democratic will is ever invoked because they don't know what they're voting for. They're literally unclear as to what the vote is about. At the very least, we have a clear option that's comparatively better than a world in which you can't be certain as to what your vote will do at all. So this is about comparatives. On the margin, you have more information, are better able to make these kinds of decisions. Furthermore, there's a vetting process by which MPs come up with that deal, which means that they filter through their national representatives in their electorates already. So that means that there's already a process by which you start to filter. We already trust representatives who largely make these kinds of decisions, except in this circumstance, the basis for the original decision was completely illegitimate, and the very basis for Brexit was wrong. We think they could get the technicalities of that specific deal done well. Okay, second argument. Why, even if Brexit happens, this is better? So, The first thing that I want to note is that in a world in which Brexit does get voted on, even under the second referendum, there isn't going to be the fraction of Britain, because every single new party, whether it's Tory or Labour, will always have a new excuse for trying to change the Brexit arrangement. They'll say there was no democratic legitimacy. So that means that Tories will rightfully try and push for a harder version of that Brexit, particularly the hardliners within the party, whereas Labour will probably try and push for a softer version. This creates an inconsistency where people in the EU, people in Britain, and the state as a whole can't create long-term planning because there isn't a solidified option which allows them to have democratic legitimacy and less consistency. Yes.
Yeah, so many of the harms you describe are symmetric. Leave will still be a more sexy word, but lies will still happen on your side. How do you solve for and indeed improve a second referendum compared to the first?
Because people are now aware of all the ways that that impacted the first referendum, which I suggest means that people will try to avoid all the illegalities, for instance. It's less likely that you have potential election campaign finance breaches a second time. And the biggest things about clarity are certainly on our side of the house. So you just engage with a sub-point when I had 6. You have to do more to defeat the argument. Come on, guys. So that's the first thing I want to know. The second thing I want to know is that this actually solidifies the hand to negotiate against the EU, because now the EU feels as if there's a solid option that will always be followed and that won't be wavered on. So the democratic legitimacy that comes from this process means that even in the process of a negotiation with the EU, you get a better Brexit because there's more likely to be a feeling of good faith and the likelihood of that going to be followed. Third and final argument about democratic cohesion. 2 things to note here. First of all, I just want to point out that if we choose to go forward with the Brexit arrangement without another referendum, this creates massive disillusionment with the system. It means that Remainers, particularly young people, feel as if they aren't heard. It also means that Leavers who don't like that particular iteration of the deal feel as if they're not being heard. I suggest that this fuels the anti-establishment beliefs that lead to things like populism rising, but also leads to young people choosing not to vote because they believe that mainstream politics is illegitimate, meaning that their preferences aren't reflected as well. The second thing I want to point out is that this actually forces Remainers to reach out to Leavers, because in the first referendum, Remainers largely thought that they were going to win regardless. A lot of them had polls that suggested that they're going to win no matter what. I think now that they know that Leavers have a significant bloc who do matter, who have significant disillusionment with the system, they're more likely to reach out in the second referendum and actually try and engage with them and try and talk about the problems that they want and alterations with the current EU scheme without leaving it. As a consequence, I think that this is a policy which is more democratically legitimate and will lead to better outcomes. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank the Speaker, Chairman, for College, the Leader of the Opposition.
Ready? I want to make very clear what the alternative is on our side of the house, because it's very straightforward. It's that a deal has emerged between the Conservative and the Labour Party, which means they can just pass it through the House of Commons and make soft Brexit the reality that Britain will deal with in the future. That is a very simple, straightforward, easy path that will create less controversy, as I will illustrate in my speech, will have less damaging effects in the long term for Britain, and will make future Brexit negotiations much easier. I think this is really important, because the political effects of a second referendum are horrible, so much more than principal illegitimacy of the first referendum. I'm going to do a couple things in my speech. First, I'm going to deal with the material we just heard coming out of Jason. Then I'm going to illustrate why the impacts of this, the practical effects on British democracy, are so horrible. So firstly, they spent the bulk of their case saying that the first referendum was principally illegitimate. I would just say you can toss all of this out if we prove that something about a second referendum has worse practical effects on the world, given we only care about principles because they have some effect on individuals' lives and their ability to make choices and their quality of existence. But furthermore, I would contend that almost any election suffers the problem that Jason identifies. People vote for parties for a variety of reasons. They often have misconceptions about what a party's policies actually are or actually aren't. People often lie in order to get votes. There are election campaign finance violations in almost every election that has ever taken place. All elections have some component of illegitimacy. And maybe people weren't clear exactly what they were voting on in the first election. But there was another election in the UK since the first referendum, and parties that supported leaving the United Kingdom got over 70% of the vote. There was a vast majority of the United Kingdom that wanted to leave and didn't want a second referendum. The party that pushed what they want was the Lib Dems. They got less than 10% of the vote. I don't think that there's a democratic mandate for what they particularly support. I think there's actually a democratic mandate for ours. Next, they claim that, because there's no mandate, people will try to shift later down the line. Look, people will claim there's no mandate anyway on their side of the house, because they will always say, my other Brexit option would have gotten a majority if only it had been put on the ballot. Norway Plus would have gotten a majority. No Deal would have gotten a majority. Everyone will be able to say that anyway. It's unclear why that changes at all. What I'm going to illustrate is why there are exclusive shifts in the political rhetoric that is likely to be created, such that you lead to a worse future in the British political system on their side of the House. What is this? It is a worsening of right-wing or populist politics, leading credence to the worst component of the Brexiteer campaigns, pushing more people into the arms of UKIP, the EPL, and the BNP, or just the right wings of the Conservative Party. Why will this take place? 3 reasons. Firstly, a second referendum is so intricately tied with the Remain cause that it is toxic to anyone who voted Leave in the initial instance. Why is it so intricately tied? Because those who immediately pushed a second referendum from the day after the first were those who lost the first one. They were the Lib Dems who supported Remain and didn't get their outcome on the ballot. It was these people who were the most vocal advocates for a second referendum from the very outset. Why is this important? Because the identity of these individuals as a Remainer tainted the cause that they were pushing for. It made it seem like the second referendum was merely a method for them to sneak Remain past the democratic mandate that had just been handed out by the first referendum. This was the narrative that a second referendum has been painted with for a significant amount of the United Kingdom's population. I would contend, therefore, that a second referendum is just horribly toxic to a significant portion of the population, such that it is likely to embolden or anger them a large degree. Secondly, it is seen as undemocratic. It is seen as we as the elite disagree with the result that you came to, and we're just going to put a referendum to you enough times till you eventually decide the way that we want. Given that the EU has done this with countries like Belgium, has done this with countries like Germany in the past, this is a narrative that struck close to home for a significant portion of the Leave cause. But it's not just those who wanted to leave. It's also those who wanted to remain, but had strong democratic principles that meant that once a vote was decided, they didn't want to see it overturned, even if they initially disagreed with the result that that election had come to. People tend not to like to see their voices being completely and utterly ignored, which is how a second referendum is going to seem, specifically because you are taking the first referendum that Remain lost, and rather than letting people choose between which Brexit option they want, per the democratic mandate, you are then giving them the option of Remain again, pushing that on them again, and trying to get them to reverse the decision that they had previously taken. But thirdly, I think this lends credence to a lot of the narratives that the hard Brexiteers have used. That the elite doesn't care what you think, that the elite wants to steal your Brexit from you, wants to give more sovereignty back to the EU. Yeah.
Your failure to engage with my principled argument is damning here, because those are the reasons why both Remainers and Leavers on both sides of the aisle currently believe that a referendum is important and legitimate.
No, this is just a lie. There's not a majority for a second referendum in the United Kingdom. When you look at the polling, it actually tends to be a majority for pushing it through the House of Commons. And even if there's a principled contention, if the outcomes of that are worse, I think that still outweighs. Why is this comparatively worse than just a soft Brexit? Look, I think a soft Brexit deal is the likely outcome of this referendum, given a significant, or basically everyone who voted Leave will vote for a soft Brexit because they still want to leave the European Union. Plus, they also think that they can get their conception of Brexit at a later date in the further negotiations, and thus they'll vote for soft Brexit now to attempt to get a harder or different form of Brexit later. But also, a significant number of people who voted for Remain still want to uphold the original democratic mandate and will thus push that through as well. Here's the problem, therefore. Maybe soft Brexit makes some people unhappy, but soft Brexit is the likely outcome on both sides of the House. All government does is push soft Brexit through, so a much more politically toxic mechanism that is likely to make the situation much worse. If they get Remain, you can imagine the political backlash of everyone who voted Leave in the first instance, and just through all of the narratives that I originally described, feel like their original vote has been stolen from them, that they were tricked, that the country had the decision that they came to overturn. Why are all of this so particularly harmful? One, you're likely to see a resurgence of the far right, a UKIP that has drifted far to the right since the initial referendum in a desperate attempt to gain prominence is likely to get voters once again. That kind of horrible racist politics is something you prefer to stay out of the United Kingdom. They make it more likely. But secondly, the second part of Brexit is likely to become harder. You make the Brexiteers feel cheated, which means they're more likely to, in the second round, want a clear near break from the European Union. Proud to oppose.
On the deputy prime minister to deliver 7-minute address.
I think the problem with the previous speech was an assumption that if Parliament just passes this deal, the divisions and hatreds caused by Brexit will be over. That Leavers will be satisfied when they see a Brexit that many of them didn't vote for. That Remainers will be satisfied when they see a Brexit that they consider illegitimate, imposed upon the country by an elite. What Jason tells you is that voting through in Parliament a soft Brexit deal is the worst possible option. But what we need is stability by having the outcome confirmed in a people's vote, and that we do need to uphold democratic values. Three things in this speech. One, why this gives stability to whatever Brexit settlement the UK gets, why that's particularly important. Two, the far right, why the far right will actually get worse if Parliament simply stitches up a soft Brexit that the far right currently claims is illegitimate and forces it through Parliament. And three, a bit more on democracy. So let's talk about stability, because I think it was a huge assumption in Trenton's speech that we'll just pass this soft Brexit and then sort of the troubles that the UK currently undergoes will be solved. I think this is completely untrue. If this deal is reached and the Labour and Tory parties pass a deal through the Commons, it's likely many of those parties will split. You will still have competing claims on both sides of the argument. So you will still have groups of Remainers who say we need to rejoin the European Union. You will still have more hardline Brexiteers saying we need to rip up this agreement and start again. The problems that this has are twofold. One, it means the continued obsession over Europe in British politics, which prevents politicians dealing with other issues. For instance, homelessness, a lack of housing. That continues because debates over Europe continue. How does this change on our side of the House? Because either outcome that gets confirmed by the referendum will have a huge stamp of democratic legitimacy. It won't be possible if you're a hard Brexiteer and the soft Brexit is confirmed in a referendum for you to claim that it is illegitimate, for you to claim that you need to go back on it. And it won't, equally, for many people, it won't be possible to say if Remain wins that we need to reverse this process. It will give a degree of stability to that settlement. It will improve the ability of the EU, of the UK to negotiate with the EU if the UK leaves. But secondly, if the UK remains, we think it's really important that it does so now, rather than the comparative, which is maybe 10 years down the line, a future UK government decides to rejoin the EU. The reasons for this is that currently the UK enjoys special privileges, essentially, as being part of the EU. It doesn't have to sign up to Schengen, it doesn't have to be a part of the euro, it gets a rebate from the EU budget. The problem that we think is likely to happen is that if in 10 years' time the UK is left on a soft Brexit that was very unpopular and a future government tries to rejoin, you won't be able to get those special privileges. If you want the current Remain deal, which is probably the best version of the UK remaining in the EU that there is, you must have a second confirmatory vote in order to confirm it, because you won't be able to return those privileges later. Go.
So your case relies upon the argument that a democratic legitimate vote will destroy any arguments that we shouldn't have this Brexit. But the premise of it, and the way the campaign would likely operate, is the previous vote was illegitimate. Why would that not function after this vote happens? Because the Brexiteers want to continue Brexiting.
I think this is largely dealt with in Jason's case, right? Because he points out that in 2016, there were a huge number of problems with the vote for Brexit which occurred. Crucially, and this got very little response from Trenton, many people voted for directly contradictory things. Sure, people in political elections sometimes vote for parties for different reasons, but like very few people vote Republican because they think voting Republican will get you like hugely pro-choice candidates and hugely pro-life candidates. But Jason points out this is exactly what many Leave voters did in 2016. That many Leave voters voted in explicitly different directions. For instance, many black and minority ethnic Britons voted for Brexit because they wanted to curb EU immigration and have more immigration from Africa and the Indian subcontinent, whereas other Brexit voters did so they could cut all immigration. Those two things are mutually contradictory, and so consequently, it validates the democratic preference of Leavers if we put that decision to a vote. If the concrete outcome, which is the only outcome which can pass the House of Commons, can be reconfirmed by voters. So it benefits those voters importantly. Secondly, though, I think Jason is correct to point out that a second referendum campaign, we can avoid some of the flaws of the first one. We are more likely to have rigorous electoral regulation of the Leave campaign, so we can stop illegal campaign spending, because we now know that was a problem in the previous one. Finally, in terms of democratic legitimacy, I want to note two things. Firstly, since 2016, there's been a significant amount of demographic churn, namely the fact that a lot of people who voted Brexit are older, and people who have joined the electorate who are younger are hugely pro-Remain. The point we would make here is that these people do now have a voice in the direction that the country is going in. It is unclear why someone who voted Leave in 2016 and has now died has more of a say over the direction of the UK than someone who was 26 and who was 16 in 2016 and must now live for the rest of their lives under that Brexit settlement. We think this is directly analogous to the way in which we do have repeat elections, right? If someone is elected to Parliament, we don't give them that job for life. We say that after a period of years, people are allowed to change their mind. So, ultimately, we think that this is the best way of getting democratic buy-in to this deal, given that hard Brexit is off the table as a result of the 2017 election, given that soft Brexit involves a compromise, given that soft Brexit involves what many people in the UK didn't want, even if they voted Leave in the first place. Finally, I want to briefly talk about the far right. The claim that they say is that a second referendum would be toxic. Two responses. Firstly, many Leave campaigns in the initial referendum did hint we could have a second referendum, right? Boris Johnson said a load of things in that referendum, one of which was, oh, we should have a second referendum to confirm the deal. But secondly, and I think this is crucial, for many Leavers, their ideal version of Brexit is preferable to Remain. But Remain is preferable to a soft Brexit. So for instance, if you want to leave the EU so that you can no longer be bound by EU regulations, a hard Brexit is great for you. But a soft Brexit, as Jason points out, is actually worse because you are still bound up with EU rules. So we think that actually many Leavers will endorse a second referendum. Finally, I want to note that if a deal is forced through by Parliament, it has absolutely no democratic legitimacy. UKIP will continue to oppose it, and they will say that it was a stitch-up in the House of Commons against the will of the people. Our side, we put it back to the people, we hinder the ability of the populists to mobilise. This is democratically vital, it's good for the UK, proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Myson College, the deputy editor of this conversation.
Everyone? I want to have 2 points of rebuttal in this speech regarding the negative effects they say if we pass the deal through Parliament and who gets upset. Then more substantive coming from opening opposition about how crucially we think it's very likely that soft Brexit will still win this referendum, and more importantly, the long-term results resulting from this, from having a referendum instead of passing it through Parliament, are far, far worse in any account, and get far, far worse if, in some instances, Remain wins. So, first, rebuttal. Opening government first says, if you pass a deal through Parliament, it's bad, because kind of people will be upset. Notice they don't really tell you about impacts of people being upset, or whatever will happen if you pass deal through Parliament. But let me give you 3 reasons why this will actually satisfy people if we pass this compromise through Parliament, and indeed no one will be upset. First, this delivers Brexit, right? So Brexiteers will not be upset because, crucially, they have come to terms with the notion that a soft Brexit is the only one that the EU will accept, and indeed that it can be negotiated in this instances, right? Second of all, critically, key Brexiteers are already on board for a soft Brexit option. Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg have already said if Labour and Theresa May reach a deal, they will accept it only because, crucially, May said that she will resign if she manages to pass a deal. And Boris Johnson and now Jacob Rees-Mogg want to gun for the leadership and want the leadership for themselves, and thus will support any deal which gets May out because they care more about their individual success within the Conservative Party than anything else. They're likely to back it. But third of all, crucially, this will probably satisfy many people because economically it puts us in an okay situation, and which avoids many of the detriments which are deemed by people as being problematic, because it puts us either in a customs union or a common market, which means maintaining much of the freedom of movement of capital and of goods, which was were the problematic issues which we were afraid about beforehand, of being compromised and then businesses moving abroad and so on. The second thing they say is, but Remainers will be upset. No, this is untrue, because crucially, Remainers will see this as a compromise, right? And crucially, all of the parties that they support have endorsed this deal and have said this is the only option we can go for. Every single representative which they voted in Parliament and their local MPs are telling them, this is the only thing we can do in this particular instance. Second of all, Remainers will likely not be upset because this is quite a soft Brexit, right? It's either a customs union or a common market 2.0, which crucially maintains many of the freedoms Remainers care about. Freedom of movement of goods. Businesses don't move abroad. Goldman Sachs doesn't move away from London. But third of all, Remainers won't be upset because Remainers are tired already. They have come to be happy with the realization that Brexit is going to happen under some form or another, and they will be very happy that at least it is a soft Brexit because they themselves are tired of this Brexit discussion. They just want it to happen, and under their terms, we can deliver that. Now, second point, and crucially from opening opposition, we tell you crucially that first of all, it's very likely that a soft Brexit option will win in their referendum anyway. One, because crucially hard Brexiteers and soft Brexiteers are likely to gather under it because they see it as the only opportunity to deliver Brexit and here Remain. But second of all, we tell you that actually many Remainers are likely to move to support soft Brexit in their referendum. 4 reasons why. First, because they see it as a compromise, right, and they know they cannot appease the far right in this country unless they go for soft Brexit. Or second of all, because crucially hate for EU has increased during these 3 years of negotiations, right? Even from Remainers, the EU has struck down a deal after deal proposed by May and has humiliated the UK. That's how it's perceived, and that's how the Daily Mail spins it, that the EU has humiliated us for these all 3 years. That's likely to spin Remainers as well. And also, the EU has been horrible generally to the British populace, right? Has been constantly, Tusk has been saying, that there's a special place in hell for the people who supported Brexit, and indeed has created far more anguish in that respect. But lastly, it's likely for a soft Brexit to happen because lots of times the rhetoric of the Brexiteer will be so enhanced by the perception that a second referendum is a deception in and of itself, right? Crucially, we tell you this is getting to the same result you would have had on our side, but with many negative effects. I'll delve into that on the long term. But I'd like to take closing.
So, if I'm a Brexiteer farmer in the city of Norwich, I prefer Brexit, but only if it means I can stop people from coming in. If it's soft Brexit, I'd rather keep my common agricultural policy. Why wouldn't I change my mind?
No. That category of people are far likelier to vote soft Brexit anyway, right? Crucially, because they have been spinned up in terms of emotions by the far right and are crucially the key demographic of the UKIP campaigns and so on. But now, onto the effects. We told you crucially that having a separate referendum means a massive empowerment of the rhetoric of Brexiteers which are divisive and the far right. Why do they gain this, and what are the effects of this? First, they gain a massive power in rhetoric because first, they can now argue that this has been massive effectively delayed by Remainers, right? We've been staying in the EU for 4 years and now an extra time for this referendum. They can now argue that you're now spending money on a useless referendum, right? Instead of dealing with the 200,000 kids which are now living under child poverty, which the Guardian has just reported earlier. Even more so, if they'll get more rhetorical ammunition, because crucially now you're very likely to have to go into EU elections, right? Because the EU has said that indeed, if you get an extension even for a referendum, you'd have to participate in EU elections in May. And crucially, anyway, legally you have to participate because you have to have the right to be represented as long as you're still in the EU. Even further, right, hard Brexiteers will push this, the use of a referendum, as proof of incompetence of the government and as not honouring any result of the prior referendum. I'll take over now.
Yeah, UKIP is gaining support by attacking MPs who vote for a soft Brexit as traitors who betrayed the 2016 result. If soft Brexit wins, we can demolish that point of view and let the
things have changed. It's no longer the case that that is true now, and they have now moved to supporting soft Brexit, but even more so, they not only will support in a referendum, but the negative effects will accrue over the long term anyway. What are those? A, you're likely to see a lack of regulation on this referendum campaign, because you can't regulate when there is no public palatability for it, when it is a state of crisis, and people feel betrayed on both sides. You cannot regulate the lies that they say happen, but also you can't regulate emotions, right? When people's emotions are running high in this instance, you cannot regulate that within the vote. Second point we bring to you is crucially that you're likely to see an uptick in hate crimes, right? Already Pakistanis, Romanians, Indians are at far higher risk within the UK of being embroiled in mob fights with Brexiteers and being attacked on the streets. You're likely to see threats on MPs and an uptick in anti-establishment feeling. This means future Tory governments have to pander to this and roughen the legislation and create, for example, very strict entry rules or deportation rules, as they're already, for example, mulling the ban on the burqa in public places. This happens far more if the Brexiteers feel cheated and push the Tory party to the right and there is a massive uptick in emotion. But later in the negotiation process with the EU, crucially, they will push for a far harsher deal for the UK because anger has been stoked by deception for a second referendum. And if somehow Remain wins, all of these divides get far worse, and on the long term, you're far likely to see a veering of the British public and the British politics making machine towards the right. Please propose.
There's a secret prison market called how the member of government
Yes.
If you were to summarize the opening opposition's case, it kind of sounds like this. Anyway, you'll have a soft Brexit. But in your world, in our world, somehow there'll be more harm in toxicity because right-wing individuals get more charged. So in this speech, I'm going to do two things. The first is I'm going to tell you why the toxicity and empowering right-wing rhetoric is at best a wash, but if anything, something we win, to do with granularity. But secondly, we'll talk about why the second referendum, crucially something opening government missed, will be better run more than two aspects. So opening government provided two things. They're aware of the problem right now, and there's clarity for the other side. We'll tell you a few more reasons why the referendum will run beyond just the fact that there's more information now than there was before. But before that, I think we need to do a bit more characterization of the kinds of right-wing individuals they want to talk about. There is no just single Brexiteer and single Remainer. There are a few diverse range of options of individuals who all vote based on different reasons, right? Some didn't like the common agricultural policy, some more hated immigration or free-flow immigration, and there are many other reasons. The point is, because at that point, when voting for the referendum to begin with, everyone had their vision of what Brexit meant. They voted on those grounds to begin with. But with a better version of what that means and what Brexit would entail, your choices and preferences would inevitably change, something opening government talked about. But what they didn't then use to respond to opening op is this, that the fact is, because your preferences changed, the reaction to the fact that you're going to propose a referendum would definitely be different, and not something just assumed to be one that will be utmost rejection just because you're previously a Brexiteer. What that means is they cannot claim the entirety of the far right as individuals who can be disillusioned, because many of those individuals prefer the granularity that comes from the ability to choose between soft Brexit, which might remove the common agricultural policy, but still keep a lot of the immigration things they didn't like, but at the same time means they lose out if they're a farmer in, say, the UK. And that's extremely important to know. So let's just compare first the kinds of individuals they want to talk about then. Because in either world, whether you have a soft Brexit or Remain, individuals who then feel disillusioned by the fact that Parliament's going through a soft Brexit will still be disillusioned on their side. The difference is there is a group of right-wing individuals who were Brexiteers to begin with, but now are given a choice, who are less likely to feel disillusioned because at least they can retract it at the point at which they know they're not going to gain anything because they don't gain any reduction in immigration, nor do they win because they lose out on common agricultural policy. That is a benefit for them that they have to consider. So, like, at best, right, because there are differences in the way in which this Brexit process will take place, they cannot claim any sort of harm, so they can't just say this outright toxicity to begin with. But if you notice, right, many of the toxic arguments they run are reliant upon, say, the ability for this referendum to be carried out really badly, which just assumed to be something that's default to necessarily the ability for that referendum to happen as it is. But before that, I'll go on to closing.
Yeah, look, the big problem with your case is that if all these right-wing people want a hard Brexit, why on earth wouldn't they just push for a hard Brexit referendum, which your policy gives the precedent for, because it says you can do so if there's illegitimacy in the first vote?
No, because the difference is, right now, with parliamentary, like, the difference is, if you have a vote right now, there's a strong democratic mandate to stop them and quelches a lot of the, say, harms or push that they have. But secondly, like, I think the difference is here. In either world, in your world, they would also push for the strong Brexit referendum anyway. So there's not necessarily a legitimacy on either side, so they can't really get that point. But let's look at why a second referendum would be run better, and hence any of the harms you just PO'd just now gets worse off. There are 4 reasons. I think the first is what was missed was the presence of the EU in the campaign. In the past, when Jean-Claude Juncker was asked as a minister and interviewed in the Brexit process or in the lead up to referendum, they were very much coy. Like, with a soft deal or not, the answer was always going to be a bad result. Now the EU is able to enter the more vision and give more information in a way that's not necessarily coy, but give the best response on many of the issues and hence clarify a lot of things. The second thing is, oftentimes currently the process is more open to international criticism, and it just means that, well, given how much of a mistake that was in the past, you just allow for a better and cleaner referendum. The third reason I think is really important is that now, because it's a soft Brexit versus Remain, it's not as nationally charged as to begin with. And it's important, right? Because the way in which Brexit was run in the past was that it's very nationally charged because you can pick on elements of nationalism, and the Leave was able to just run a very soft campaign on everything. But now it's different because now it's on the specific information. But the last bit is really important. The parties involved in the previous Brexit process, in the lead up to a vote, were partisan. And that means to say they were very split. But this deal is coincidentally a very bipartisan deal. What does this mean? This means the bipartisanship between Labour and Conservatives forces those two individuals and parties to come together on a unified front for Brexit negotiations in the process of leading up to the vote. That is important, right? Because then you don't get the same sort of split you got when many of the Labour in the lead up to the Brexit referendum the first way were very coy, and like Jeremy Corbyn, for example, were tacitly wanting, say, David Cameron to lose out because this just means it's a bad thing for the Conservative Party. That difference is really important because then you allow for a Brexit process that's not influenced by, say, the hard realities of politics like in the past. I'll take over.
Yeah, if your case is basically that I voted for something that this soft Brexit doesn't allow for, you have to recognize that people are not perfectly rational actors. What often decides their preferences are narratives, beliefs, feelings, things they have been told about a second referendum. We gave you a variety of them at the start that none of Gov has bothered to engage with.
I mean, look, the narratives, feelings, and all the things you talk about in Parliament's deciding has the same sort of effects on individuals because it just means they're unable to get the same sort of democratic mandate anyway. But the point is, I think, that you don't win is the fact that they have more options now, and that allows for them to recalculate their choices, and that's why they're less likely to react in a certain way. But the last thing is, I think on most cases, both parties are unwilling to fuck it up. Because given the result of the previous Brexit referendum and the consequences it had to people who did tarnish the process and make misinformation, there's less likely for politicians at the moment who are going to run for the second referendum to take it upon themselves to misinform individuals. And that means less of incentive that you see with Boris Johnson and other individuals. That's why the process is going to be more clean. What is the impact of this? And the impact first is that you just mean that you guarantee the sort of second referendum that's cleaner, a goal opening government wanted to begin with. But secondly, I think the impact of this is there's a strong signaling benefit from recognizing that the campaign in the initial vote was wrong. That is, if you agree, if you hold another referendum, that is a tacit agreement that that campaign was wrongly run, and that gives a lot of precedent, that sets precedent against any individuals who want to use referendums as a cop-out to determine very important policies. David Cameron opted to hold the referendum, not because he believed in Brexit, but because he didn't want to take accountability for the fact and to tell the British people that Brexit was a bad idea. And so he went to a referendum so that to avoid that blame and say the people decided instead. Look, all this political game playing has risked the future of many countries, and using this referendum as a way to signal that that action was inherently wrong sets precedent for future actions like that to be less desirable with politicians, because it just means the ramifications that happen at this point. That is extremely important, right? Because at the point at which you're gambling with many of the people's future, it's better then that you have this sort of referendum as a signaling point that they don't get. So at the end of this debate, we need to compare the reactions of toxicity in the right wing and the disillusionment. On the other side, maybe some right wingers would necessarily feel okay about it, but you have a huge amount of disillusioned people, the people who came to protest a few weeks ago in Westminster. Those individuals, they don't win. Because it's a wash, science closing down.
Thank you very much for his remarks and call upon the member of the opposition to discuss the opposition.
Under the status quo, crazy right-wing people and Brexiteers push against the notion of a soft Brexit or Remain because of the narrative that Brexit means Brexit and that is what the people voted for. What government teams do in this debate, necessarily, is unlocks the shackles of their rhetoric and gives them a platform to argue that a second referendum was also illegitimate and therefore is not something which can be held to be justified or to represent the democratic mandate of the people. Note that the comparative in this debate is very clear, and I'll be the first person to make it that clear. That's to say that when you do it through Parliament, there is much more path dependency to the option, because you don't say that every decision which we disagree on can be settled by referendums ad infinitum. So with that said, I'll give 4 prongs of extension in this debate before I deal with the principled clashing opening half. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why precedent is important and why that impacts the referendum system and parliamentary decisions more broadly. Because the mechanism here is that it sets a precedent of agitation and obstruction as being not only constructive, but effective and sufficient in terms of democratic will as a means and mechanism for pushing back against a decision that you do not agree with. And that is not obstruction which comes from right-wing people, as opening opposition says, not necessarily. It is also obstruction which is going to be perceived to be coming from not only people from the left, but also Remainers, for example, Theresa May herself. And the key is there is not just that there are no other leave options on the table, as opening half argues and quabbles about. It is the fact that Remain is there. And that engages with all of the opening half's principle anyway about how this devalues legitimacy and the notion that referendums, that if you make them, are binding. Even if they are to be, in some instance, like technically advisory, as the first one was, that is not how people perceived it. But then CG tries to extend here and say, it's not as politically charged. Of course it will be more politically charged, because the stakes are probably now much more clearer, but that's problematic in the way in which hardline Brexiteers can weaponise that rhetoric against people more broadly. The impacts there are twofold. Firstly, obviously it impacts the decision to make any other referendums ever in the future, as it implicitly comes out in opening up but is not substantiated. But secondly, and a much wider impact that we provide to you, is it impacts any parliamentary decision ever, because you can say that votes by Parliament are not justified and are not democratically representative of the will of the people. Look at the narratives that already exist about the fact that we have meaningful vote 3, and what an absolute ridiculousness that is. These are the exact same rhetorics which get emboldened on their side. Another impact which we would add here is the way in which this changes business certainty. Because, and as I will prove in this speech, it is more likely that further referendums will follow, but what that means is that you don't get any of the confidence of a parliamentary vote for businesses. That's what fucks over the UK economy, because there's no point to invest in Britain, because you have no certainty that they won't change Brexit in the future, or vote remain in the referendum, but then vote later in another referendum to still move. So, second prong of extension, let's talk about party politics in the United Kingdom. Firstly, I want to answer the questions that I've already foreshadowed about whether there will be more referendums in the future on the basis of this second referendum. We think it is intuitively true that there will be. The mechanism that we add is who will be pushing for that. That's to say that it's not something which is divided necessarily on partisan lines, but if you take certain members of the Tory party who are Brexiteers and hardliners, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg and the research group that he's a part of, or Eurosceptic Labour politicians, they both have an incentive to now latch onto the same rhetoric and attack that from both sides of the parliament, and that makes a much more effective mechanism for you to say the vote was illegitimate and that we ought to have another. CG lies and says the original vote was partisan. Obviously it wasn't. Both parties were heavily divided. That division still occurs, but is emboldened on your side when you say that another referendum is something which we can usurp and have a third referendum for. The context there is that hard-right Brexiteers may never be satisfied, but on the margins, Parliament is more palatable to them, as both government teams seem to note when they talk about Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. But it's not only them, it's more palatable to the people as well, and that's why you're more likely to get another vote and further votes on their side. Next, I want to add material on parliamentary politics in extension. This guarantees, obviously, that Theresa May will be replaced with a hardliner. They say Theresa May will still resign. Yes, she will. The point is now that the Tory Brexiteer that you put in power is incredibly emboldened in a way which wasn't in the status quo. The impact there is not just that they passed worse laws, but what we uniquely add in this debate is that they implement Brexit poorly because they have an incentive for it to go poorly, so that they can have another vote and get what they wanted all along, which was a hard Brexit. They say this solidifies the bargaining hand against the EU without realising that they've already made the deal with the EU. You can only gain concessions, guys. As in, you can only lose concessions and get worse territory in the deal with the EU. But finally, I want to talk about how this impacts the division in Parliament. Note that if you push Brexit through Parliament, a few crazies maybe leave the Tory party, but not enough to substantially harm it on a, parliamentary scale. But if you have a second referendum, a lot more crazy people leave the Tory party. That harms the Tory party much more, which means that you have much stronger far-right parties, which is a mechanism we add on top of OO. Government's rhetoric is exactly why people who hate the EU will agitate for another vote. CG says in your world you can agitate anyway. The difference is people on the margins and in the middle cannot be convinced when it's passed through Parliament, but they can when it's a referendum. Sure, open.
Yeah, there's absolutely no majority in the present Parliament for a referendum on hard Brexit. And when in 2017 Theresa May ran on a platform of even flirting with hard Brexit, she lost her majority. Your claims are simply unplausible.
What are you talking about? Like you're propping, like you're kind of propping that democratically. I'll get to that later in the illegitimacy stuff. I'm closing. POI.
Yeah, so if you assume that hard Brexiteers are now politically charged, aren't you overestimating the fact that it's illegitimate? Many of the claims that they have to charge for a second referendum is due to misinformation. All that is lost.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll briefly bring that in. Do you not think that there will be misinformation and interference in the second referendum? I don't think that the laws have been, that you can stop shell companies existing and you can stop people funding Nigel Farage and Aaron Baines. Obviously, misinformation still exists, but also probably actors like Russia have more of an incentive to do it now because it will further destabilise the EU. Even if that is marginally, that is still a benefit for our side, or if it is in a catalytical sense, as in it is multiplicative, they'll still do it anyway. So, next I want to talk briefly about UKIP before I talk about illegitimacy. Firstly, on UKIP. Note that the actual mechanism you miss here is that UKIP is a one-party or single-issue party, which has a first-mover advantage from being the party which was first against Brexit. Obviously, therefore, you are emboldened in a more tangible sense as UKIP now, because you're not bound by party lines, and you've already been shown to be morally duplicitous, therefore you're likely to be able to, or want to, have more people to vote for you, and you're more likely to get that. So, briefly weighing in on the clash on illegitimacy, I think opening half misses the issue here, because the comparative that they draw is from the first referendum to the second referendum. Obviously the comparative is not that, the comparative is about what you do going forward. And note also, if the first vote is perceived as illegitimate, no team in opening half really answers the question of why the second will be, or why that would stop, and why you would not have the fifth or the sixth. They say it's the exact same thing as voting out a new politician in an electoral cycle. Yes, that's probably the exact rhetoric why people are likely to say it's illegitimate.
Remarks and calls upon the government which
Yeah.
Closing opposition talk about the precedent is set for the referendum. They're ignoring what Razak says, which is that the precedent isn't undermining Parliament, the precedent is undermining the first referenda, which for a variety of factors was normatively different to any kind of other referenda which happens. What Razak tells you specifically is A, specific mechanisms which weren't engaged with about why this is going to be a better discussion and a better referendum the second time around and hence more legitimate. But I think more importantly, why it then shows why there has to be a higher standard for holding referenda, because you know that it can be overturned. Just because you can run a campaign and manipulate the population by lying to them into voting for something and spreading misinformation doesn't mean that you can then hold that throughout Parliament. That's incredibly important in terms of how we make decisions in the first place. I think that crashes well with closing opposition. So let's start by looking at their extension and how it weighs against that. So they say precedent matters. This is bad because it's undermining the decision you don't agree with. I think, first of all, the extent to which we concede this is that we do think referenda are a terrible way to do anything. If this has happened between Parliament in the first place, we wouldn't have to undermine it. The problem is that by giving legitimacy to the previous one, all the terrible behaviours which were outlined then go fine because people just accept that's the legitimate way to do things. I think the standard we have to put on politicians is much higher than that. Because as I told you that when the referendum was implemented, it was a way to save face. It was a complacency. It was a political act to be like, David Cameron, I don't have to take a hard stance because that would be difficult for me, so I'm going to just let everyone else decide. Referenda should never be that much of a cop-out, and we think allowing that to continue and allowing that vote to be held just sets a harmful precedent in terms of how it happens in the future. But I think, secondly, what's more important, they never weighed up against the precedent of overturning referenda versus the weighing up of why it will happen badly. Because I think if it's incredibly illegitimate and it happens in a bad way, it's better to set a precedent that you have to have a good one to create a more legitimate result. This links onto the mechanisms Razak gave you, which were blatantly ignored about why this will run well. He said a couple of things. I think, first of all, the way it changes the discussion when the comparison is a soft Brexit versus like what all of the rhetoric was before, which is aggressively take back control, all those kind of things which are based on nationalist sentiment. When a soft Brexit doesn't have the same kind of hardcore policy lines which fueled the nationalist rhetoric, it moves to a much more reasonable platform. That's specifically important, given I think the characterization of toxicity is true on the extreme basis, but most of the British population just want to move on and want clear answers and want to engage in a reasonable debate. I think that's why moving it towards this platform away from all the fragmentation of before is incredibly critical to getting a better thing. I think Razak's extension here engages with O's point about minorities being a risk and making the discourse significantly worse. Because when the comparison is a soft Brexit, is much less likely to be extreme than the comparison is when you're going to be polarised. I think, particularly given people are more likely to buy into the Brexit referendum, the second referendum, and given they want to have some kind of feeling of agency and not be dictated to by politicians, they characterise this as people, that's what happens when you ask for a second referendum, without engaging with the fact this is literally the status quo. When people see incompetent politicians doing things which no one is happy for, putting down ridiculous amounts of deals, the feeling of having that power and having investment in a second referendum is at least comparatively better, given it happens in a better way. But this is particularly true, given the second mechanism Razak gave you, about how there is less political fragmentation and infighting because parties are much more unified right now. Not only that, but given the political devastation of what happens before, they're significantly more incentivized to make sure it happens in a good way. That's why you're going to give more legitimacy to court rulings or court advice on what is legal and what is not legal, because all the accusations from before show that this was an unacceptable thing to do, which isn't something you should just let hold, because that is harmful to referenda process in the future. That's what ruins democracy. I think this impact extends beyond just Brexit, but to any kind of political process. Opening.
Yeah, passing it through Parliament is better. It has support of key figures. All parties supported it at the start, whilst very few supported the second referendum. The mere presence of Remain is agitating, and Remainers unhappy doesn't lead to racism, whilst Leave for Activate does. All from OO to no response.
So this is the thing. OO literally gave reasons about why all parties support this for their own political incentives. So because they want the leadership or because they feel trapped, without an explanation of why that is a good way to make a decision or a way that people will feel is accepted. Because people literally have the perception this political gameplay. That's why Boris Johnson is supporting this for his own interests, as they said. That's not something which makes people feel like it's legitimate. That just is them utilising their own self-interest to perpetuate this narrative of British politics being incredibly terrible. I think breaking down those kind of reasons and stopping that kind of exact incentive which OO talked about is incredibly beneficial in terms of making people feel like they're invested in the Brexit process. Because even when you have a deal, implementing that deal is one of the hardest things. And if you have a population who's disengaged and doesn't agree with what happened, that is going to be much more difficult to do. So I think it falls on that basis. No, thank you. So I think what Razak proved to you is he looked at why this process will happen in a better way, such that it's likely to be accepted as legitimate. I think closing opposition can say, people will see it as illegitimate and will want a second one, and we'll want another one after, without engaging with a couple of things. First of all, even though there are hard Brexiteers, there's no way there's going to be a significant amount to be able to underturn something which most people think is legitimate, because most people want to have a second, better discussion, and that's incredibly important. But second of all, what closing opposition never do is weigh the trade-off of having a second referendum versus the kind of referendum you have, because I think what was qualitatively and obviously bad about the Brexit process, so much that it got massive international scrutiny, was the way it happened, and the way it went down, and the way people were lied to, rather than having a discussion which was proper. So it's not about what the specific result was, it's about those people who were misled in the way they cast their vote and decided things. I'm closing.
If people didn't like the first vote because they're unhappy with politicians not doing their job or they were subject to misinformation, that still exists under a second referendum, you say there aren't enough right-wingers to agitate for a third referendum, you're the team that reanimates the dead corpse of Nigel Farage.
But I think most people want to engage in a referendum that happens properly. Rather, I gave so many reasons when he talks about the presence of the EU, international criticism, the way you change the discourse to be less extreme, the way you get less political fragmentation because all parties want a better thing, so that it's going to happen in a better way, such that people want it to be legitimate. That's why you get significantly less backlash against this referendum. I think critically that's the missing link from opening government, because they say people want a higher referendum and don't hold us to higher standards, whereas like the ones who give you specific reasons about how that comes about and why that's more important. I think that's why Razak's extension wins. Firstly, because we prove you get the benefits of what opening government say, so like information, legitimacy of the Brexit vote, happy people. But also, if it runs well, you minimise the harms of toxicity, because most people aren't the blinkered extreme people which opposition want to characterise everyone as. People want to have opinions. The reason it got so extreme and fragmented is because people didn't feel listened to, felt ignored. The thing which you fix when you make a process which is much more accessible and much fairer, so that's incredibly important in terms of comparing it. Yeah, that's incredibly important. But let's look specifically at the arguments left standing about like toxicity and how this affects it. So they say opening opposition is toxic to anyone who voted leave, and this creates much more fragmented things. I don't think there's ever a comparison of why this isn't the status quo or why this is better than the status quo. I think if we tell you the soft Brexit discussion takes it away from the extreme wings of the party and you stop giving voice to the people who are the most toxic, there is a way of making the discussion focus on something which is much more productive and much more likely to lead to better outcomes. Particularly given everyone is like sick of this beyond. People stick to their opinions, but they don't engage with the fact that most people just want a process in which they don't feel manipulated, and they don't feel controlled, and they don't feel out of that. So I think there's never any way up of why these specific few people who are going to be harmed on that, it's going to be significant enough that it's going to destabilize the process, which can happen in a much more qualitatively better way when people aren't being lied to, aren't having those things. Opening opposition say it feels like the elite don't care about you, which is symmetrical when people right now feel like they have no voice. I would just say the principle of autonomy, at least the feeling of autonomy that you're engaging in, and you're having a better process which is much less fragmented and much less extreme. It's incredibly, incredibly empowering. Regardless of what the outcome is, you gain much more legitimacy and trust. I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, Speaker, for remarks and call upon the opposition vote to conclude this argument.
There's a phone lock.
No, it's
My
not.
lock. A very short lock.
There's actually a beautiful nugget of gold in that speech for the op case. And that nugget is that if this campaign will not be toxic, that people want to settle the scores, etc., that is literally the mechanism of why they would actually be happy with a vote in Parliament existing, passing the current policy, and wouldn't have all their harms. But that's why we win the debate. because we're the only side that engaged with what this referendum would actually look like and how it changes incentives. Because, given that opening government and closing government concede how horrendous referendums are, and opening opposition kind of flippantly push about, maybe right-wing politicians get empowered, we tell you that referendums do a few things. Firstly, they create game theory incentives for conservatives to push against particular policies and split from the party line. Secondly, they create incentives for hard right-wingers to be platformed because they now have a single issue they can campaign upon in a referendum with government funding that opening government seem to want to legislate, which they never otherwise would get. Because UKIP is currently irrelevant because it is seen as the score being scheduled, but now actually becomes so much more relevant because the issue is live. That is such a concrete win for us. Because if Gov is so mitigatory to say we get some marginal legitimacy benefits they never actually prove, we're the ones that prove why those parties get empowered, why it's toxic for the policies implemented in the future, and therefore why you ought actually oppose the motion rather than the mechanistically lacking case from opening opposition. So, firstly, opening opposition's case was brilliantly reductive of mechanisms. More right-wing sentiment, opposition, but it misses the critical mechanisms of how this actually manifests in terrible harms. Firstly, what this Brexit referendum will do to the incentives of different parties. Because we told you, they're more likely to agitate for future referendums. Let's consider two worlds. Either the Gov world in which there is a Remain vote that wins, obviously, therefore, there's likely to be a push for a new referendum. We told you the fact that it is such a toxic thing, firstly, and secondly, it takes away the current narrative that exists, which is that the public mandate must be respected, means you can push for this. But importantly, that Brexit would be harder because you're empowering the kind of people to get the platform of pushing against that. Therefore, if we have a new vote, it is far worse. But secondly, even if we vote to exit, the point is that there is the threat of indeterminacy. So even the rebuttal given flippantly by CG that, well, it's unlikely to form a coalition, isn't sufficient. Because the fact that people keep agitating, pushing for parliamentary representation to implement it differently, implement it in a more conservative fashion, cut more taxes, etc. All those things will weaken business confidence, weaken certainty. Those things don't exist when you keep the keep the beans in the can, stop all those heated political discussions happening, and allow for a concrete narrative surrounding the deal that was agreed upon by those politicians to actually exist. That was so important. But importantly, we give you the mechanism of interference that countries like Russia would likely hack into emails, leak those emails, interfere and fund foreign candidates. For example, fund bots to spread disinformation. Why? Massive incentive to corrupt the vote, change it, make it be seen as corrupt in order to lead to a new vote occurring and create all the threats to democracy. A system which OG and CG can see is vulnerable to being corrupted and influenced, but never provide a mechanism to insulate it from that corruption in this vote. That is all reasons why we comprehensively take it over OO, because they give you the headlines but never give you the actual analysis, and we go horizontally over them too. Let's deal with CG. I know obviously it doesn't matter for us, but they were obviously derivative from closing off opening government in the sense that the mechanisms were non-additive in the context of whether or not this is actually beneficial. But let's deal with them. First, let's say it's a different comparison of a soft Brexit versus no Brexit. Obviously the problem with that, right, is the only distinguishing factor is the nationalism of being separate from the EU. That narrative is obviously far more toxic, but secondly, as we told you, there's an incentive to split against it. Say, we're going to push for a harder Brexit. Say, look at the EU tyranny. Say, look at the centrists who are betraying your vote and not allowing you to have a Norway deal or any other deal. Obviously that's going to be more toxic. Obviously we tell you that's far worse. Secondly, they say parties will be bipartisan. Lol, obviously parties are bipartisan when they sign a deal, but when you have the vote, politicians can do whatever the fuck they like, as they did in the first election. So the Tories will split and oppose a deal that they may have supported in the political arena, but don't support in the actual election, because they can win further elections by being seen as to the right of those candidates, by saying, vote Remain so we can get a Brexit vote later, or vote soft Brexit, don't vote this. They finally say there's less misinformation, with no mechanisms. Stuart did a wonderful job, frankly, of explaining all the incentives to create all the same misinformation that would occur. The impacts are also really terrible, because they say it is better, and you push against the terribleness of the first referendum without recognising they destroy the legitimacy of the first referendum in the first place. CG then responds to our case with a few things. They say the big thing is there will never be the hard Brexit a group that can actually push for this. We told you firstly they're empowered since they can vote for a second thing, but secondly the agitation against implementation is massive. Given I've dealt with them and I've dealt with them, I'll start the last 2 minutes dealing with the open government case. The open government case was first of all horrendously condescending, because if you're going to say we're Australians and we understand Brexit politics, just run a better case, do more mechanistic analysis on the way politics functions, because they're horrendously flippant on the practical outcomes. They say, and the reason why is they're like the best case is Remain, but never prove it. We prove why it's not Remain. But But the worst case is you get an outcome but then a vote, and run this very principled nonsense to try to prove why it's beneficial, with no legwork to prove why you need a vote on top of that. I'll take a PY because I have to, yes.
There were severe political ramifications for people who were toxic and partisan during the election, during the referendum, the first Brexit referendum. Doesn't that mean it's a strong incentive now for politicians to be less partisan, more bipartisan, especially when the deal
That's
is
just
made?
so generic. Like, obviously a Conservative is going to push back against this referendum. Obviously any individual has an incentive to support or oppose Brexit will do so. That doesn't apply because obviously you're hard right. You get way more vote based from your electorate. It's not a national vote, it's an electoral vote. I'll take opening.
Okay. Johnson and Rees-Mogg eventually voted for May's deal only because they thought it was preferable to soft Brexit. They and the hard right will oppose any soft deal passed with Labour votes. The only way to silence them and get the stability you want is by having the actual democratic
You just give them a massive platform in the referendum and a massive capacity to undermine it through our mechanism of legitimacy, which always shouldn't table tap because we brought uniquely at closing. So, dealing with their idea is democratic. They say it's vague, we tell you that other options aren't included, so it's equally as undemocratic. They then say it's comparative, and it's a comparative edge in democracy. Obviously, we beat them there because there's no explanation of why a little bit more democracy is principally valid, because you don't meet the threshold of absolute democracy, so your principle falls. At that point, we told you that 51% of people voted for leave, and so it means that your principle is way more undemocratic if you're providing an alternative that is like, so what our case is right is like, if everyone wants leave and you have MPs decide, they vote for their MPs, so that negotiation process is actually more democratic, because it's linking to that mechanism of democracy rather than the vote one. The next thing they say is the changes in the voting base. That happens to all policies, completely uncomparative. The final thing they say is better regulation. They can't figure out it. We explain all the reasons why it's likely to not be legitimate. We dealt comparatively with all the practical material and why it doesn't actually lead to legitimacy. The last thing they say is that it's better for reaching out, but obviously all the incentives are to oppose. Speaker, this massively platforms and evolved on the right. Neither Cup side gives benefits to that, apart from an abstract principle of democracy that they never actually prove and never impact. We don't want to empower UKIP. We don't want to empower the Conservatives splitting off. We're so proud to oppose the motion.